Heartless millionaire kicks his wife out of the house because she can't have children. 7 years later, he's shocked to see his ex-wife with twins who look exactly like him. The Warburton estate was cloaked in an eerie kind of quiet, the kind that wasn't peaceful, but oppressive. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the parlor marked the passing minutes, like a judge announcing a sentence. Keith Warburton sat in the library, his broad shoulders hunched, as he stared at a tumbler of untouched bourbon on the mahogany desk before him. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, its warmth failing to reach the cold knot tightening in his chest. His mother's words from that morning echoed in his mind, sharp and unyielding. "She's barren, Keith. Do you understand what that means for this family? For the Warburton name. It's time to end this charade before it costs you everything." Kimberly Warburton, regal and unbending, had stood before him like a figure carved from ice. She hadn't raised her voice. She never needed to. Her words sliced through the air with precision, designed to cut, not wound. "You're the head of this family now," she continued, each syllable deliberate. "A Warburton doesn't cling to dead weight, especially not a girl from nowhere with no bloodline, no connections and no heirs." Keith's jaw tightened. "Michelle is my wife." Kimberly had waved her manicured hand dismissively, her diamond bracelet catching the morning light. "And she's had 3 years to fulfill her role. Don't have a single child. How much longer are you willing to let this continue before it ruins you? Ruins us." Keith felt the pressure of his mother's expectations crushing him like a vice. He clenched his fists until the knuckles whitened, but the trembling in his hands betrayed him. Michelle hummed softly as she folded laundry in the small sitting room, sunlight streaming through the bay window. The soft notes of her voice filled the space, weaving a fragile piece into the fabric of the day. She glanced at the clock, her expression softening. Keith would be home soon. Her hands moved rhythmically, but her mind wandered. She thought of the way Keith used to smile at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners like he couldn't contain his joy. Lately, that smile had become scarce, replaced by a tension she didn't know how to soothe. The weight of their unspoken failures, particularly hers, hovered between them like a spectre. The door creaked open, and Keith's footsteps echoed down the hall. She looked up, her heart quickening with both relief and apprehension. He hesitated in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by the dim light of the corridor. "You're home early," Michelle said, her tone light but tinged with nervousness. She set down the shirt she had been folding and wiped her hands on her apron. "I was thinking we could—" "Michelle?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it stopped her mid-sentence. She froze, her smile faltering. Keith stepped into the room, his gaze darting to the floor as if he couldn't bear to meet her eyes. His hands found the back of a chair, gripping it tightly. The silence stretched between them, the air thick with unspoken words. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice strained, "about us." Her brows knit together, and she stepped closer. "Keith, what's wrong?" The tenderness in her voice, which had once grounded him, now twisted him with guilt. He forced himself to look at her, her delicate features, the way her hair fell softly over her shoulders, her eyes full of concern. I think we need to separate." The words dropped like stones into the fragile stillness of the room. For a moment, Michelle didn't move, didn't breathe. Her lips parted slightly, as if she were about to speak, but no sound came. "What?" she finally whispered, her voice cracking. "Why are you saying this?" Keith's throat tightened. He struggled to express the truth to her, realizing that his mother's ultimatum had compelled him to act, and his love for her was insufficient to overcome the burden of the Warburton name. Instead, he leaned into the lie that had been rehearsed in his head, though it tasted like ash on his tongue. "This isn't working, Michelle. It's been 3 years and we're not building the life we hoped for." Her eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. "Keith, we can fix this. It's not something we can fix," he interrupted, his voice harder than he intended. "It's just over." Michelle's breath hitched, and she stepped back as if he had struck her. Her hand instinctively moved to her stomach, the place where life had never taken root. The gesture made Keith's chest ache, but he didn't reach for her. The clock chimed softly, a cruel reminder of time slipping away. Michelle finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Is this because of me? Because I—" "No," he said quickly, too quickly. "It's just what has to be." She stood there, her frame fragile, yet unbroken. "If you walk away from me, Keith, I don't think I'll ever forgive you." Keith swallowed hard, the weight of her words crashing over him. But he turned away, his steps heavy as he left the room. The sound of the door closing behind him echoed through the house like the final note of a funeral dirge. In the empty silence that followed, Michelle sank into the chair he had gripped moments earlier. The warmth of his touch lingered on the wood, a cruel reminder of what she had lost. The storm outside the Warburton estate mirrored the chaos in Michelle's chest. Rain lashed against the tall windows, streaking the glass, like tears. She stood in the foyer, her small suitcase by her feet, trembling fingers wrapped around the handle. Keith was perched on the edge of the staircase, his back rigid, as if the banister behind him held him upright. He avoided her gaze, staring somewhere beyond her shoulder. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white. "Keith," Michelle's voice broke, soft and raw. "Please, just tell me why." His jaw tightened, a slight movement that revealed the tension coiled within him. He didn't answer. 3 years, Keith." Her words spilled out, shaky but unrelenting. 3 years of a marriage you promised would stand against anything. You stood right there. She gestured toward the grand archway where they'd exchanged vows. "And you told me we'd face every storm together. And now you're—" Her voice cracked, faltering under the weight of her grief. "Now you're asking me to leave." "It's better this way," he muttered, still refusing to look at her. His tone was clipped and cold, and it struck her like a slap. "Better for who?" she whispered, her breath hitching. "For your mother, for your legacy. What about us, Keith? What about me?" When he finally raised his gaze to hers, the steel in his gaze did not mitigate the impact. "This isn't about anyone else, Michelle. This is about what's right." Michelle staggered back a step, her chest tightening as if the air had been stolen from the room. She scanned his face, desperate to find some trace of the man she had loved, the man who had once made her laugh so hard she cried, who had held her hand like it was the most sacred thing in the world. But he was gone, buried under the weight of expectations she couldn't fight. "Right," she repeated, the word dripping with bitterness. Her hands shook as she reached for the suitcase, lifting it with an effort that felt heavier than it should have. "If this is what you call right, then you've lost far more than just me, Keith." Her heels clicked against the polished marble as she moved toward the door. She paused, turning back one last time. Her gaze lingered on the man she had given everything to, her voice soft but resolute. "You'll regret this." As she stepped outside, the rain welcomed her with a cold slap. Her thin cardigan offered little protection against the elements, and the wind bit at her cheeks, sending shivers down her spine. The suitcase banged against her legs as she trudged down the driveway, the grand Warburton estate looming behind her like a hollow shell. Michelle didn't look back. The train rumbled as it crossed into the Chicago city limits, its wheels humming a rhythm that seemed to echo her thoughts. Michelle stared out the window, her reflection blurred against the rain-slicked glass. The city's towering skyline loomed in the distance, a jagged silhouette against the overcast sky. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag, the weight of the small life she had packed pressing into her palm. It was all she had now, a few clothes, a worn photo of her wedding day tucked into the pocket of a coat she couldn't bring herself to wear anymore, and a growing ache in her chest. The train pulled into the station with a metallic groan. Passengers bustled around her, brushing past in a flurry of umbrellas and hurried steps. Michelle remained seated for a moment, her breath shallow, her pulse thudding in her ears. "Ma'am?" A conductor's polite voice jolted her. "This is the last stop." She nodded quickly, standing on unsteady legs. The platform was cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of wet concrete and the faint tang of diesel. She followed the crowd into the city, her steps uncertain but deliberate. Michelle wandered through the unfamiliar streets of Chicago, the weight of her loneliness pressing down with every step. The towering buildings seemed to swallow her, their shadows casting her into a sea of strangers. With shaking hands, she found a modest hotel off a quieter street and paid for a week's stay. The room was small, its walls a faded beige, but it was warm and dry. She dropped her suitcase by the bed and sank onto the mattress, her head falling into her hands. The tears came slowly at first, then all at once, her body shaking with the force of her sobs. The enormity of what she had lost washed over her, drowning her in waves of grief and exhaustion. But as the night wore on, a strange stillness settled over her. Her tears dried, leaving only the faint tremor in her chest. She lay back on the bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, her breathing steadying. "Tomorrow," she thought. "Tomorrow, I'll figure it out." The city outside hummed with life, its heartbeat steady and relentless. For the first time in weeks, Michelle let herself close her eyes, holding on to the smallest flicker of resilience. She was still here, and that, for now, was enough. Michelle stirred awake to a dull ache in her temples, the faint hum of city noise seeping through the paper-thin hotel walls. The sunlight that filtered in through the faded curtains felt sharp against her swollen eyes. She sat up slowly, her body heavy, her mind heavier. Yesterday's storm, both literal and emotional, still lingered in her bones. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, planting her feet on the cold floor. The mirror above the dresser reflected someone she barely recognized. Hollow eyes, disheveled hair, and a pallor that made her look like a ghost. But as she stared, something flickered in her gaze, a trace of defiance, faint but present. She pulled on her cardigan and decided to take the first step toward rebuilding her life. The nausea hit her a week later. It wasn't sudden, but it came often, waves of unease rising in her stomach each morning. At first, Michelle dismissed it as stress, or the consequence of days spent eating little more than crackers and tea from a nearby diner. But as the dizziness persisted, a gnawing thought crept into her mind, one she was too afraid to name. The confirmation came in the form of a doctor's soft, matter-of-fact voice. "Miss, you're pregnant. In fact, you're expecting twins." Michelle froze, her hands gripping the edges of the chair as if the ground beneath her had shifted. The small, sterile room felt suddenly too bright, too confined. She didn't answer right away, letting the doctor's words settle like ripples on a pond. Twins. The word felt surreal, both a gift and a burden. "Are you all right, miss?" the doctor asked gently, his brows furrowed with concern. She nodded slowly, the knot in her throat tightening. "Yes," she whispered. I just need a moment." She walked out of the clinic, clutching the thin sheet of paper that listed her due date and basic health instructions. The cold January wind whipped around her, but Michelle barely felt it. Fear, joy, and a fierce resolve simmered beneath her thoughts. She stopped by the park, finding a bench dusted with snow. Sitting down, she traced her fingers over the paper, her breath puffing in the frigid air. Keith's face flashed in her mind, his cold detachment, his clipped words. He would never know. He had forfeited the right to. For her unborn children, she resolved that the Warburton name and everything it stood for would never touch them. Michelle threw herself into building a new life. She found a small apartment on the outskirts of Chicago, just big enough to accommodate a crib when the time came. The building was old, the walls thin enough to hear her neighbors arguing, but it was hers. She worked at a local cafe, long shifts that left her feet aching, but her wallet marginally fuller. It was there that she first met Andrew, a regular customer with a kind smile who tipped generously and always asked how she was holding up. She was polite, but guarded, her focus entirely on survival and the growing lives inside her. By the third trimester, her belly was round and heavy, and her movements slower. She spent evenings knitting small sweaters she hoped would keep her twins warm in the Chicago winters. The routine of it, simple, methodical, steadied her in ways she couldn't explain. The labor came in the early hours of a cold April morning. Michelle woke with a start, her breath hitching as pain rippled through her body. The next hours were a blur of sharp contractions, rushing to the hospital in a cab, and the antiseptic smell of the delivery room. "Push, Michelle," the nurse urged, her voice steady. "You're almost there." Michelle clenched her teeth, tears cascading down her cheeks as she delivered a final push. The piercing cry of a baby filled the room, and then another. The sound was raw, life-affirming. She collapsed back against the pillows, her chest heaving as the nurse gently placed two swaddled bundles in her arms. Two identical faces stared up at her, their tiny features soft and delicate. Carl and Oliver. She had chosen the names quietly, in the stillness of her apartment, long before this moment. Now, seeing them, they felt perfect. She traced a finger along Carl's tiny cheek, then Oliver's. Tears filled her eyes, but this time, they weren't from pain. They were from love, so overwhelming it made her chest ache. "I'll protect you," she whispered, her voice trembling, "no matter what." Back in her apartment a week later, the three of them settled into a rhythm. It wasn't easy. Sleepless nights, endless bottles to prepare, and the constant hum of exhaustion. But Michelle persevered. The boys' laughter, even in its infant form, became her anchor. Each night as she held them close, she found herself repeating the same quiet promise. "You'll never know the pain I did," she murmured, her voice steady even when her heart wavered. "You'll grow up free from all of it." Her love for Carl and Oliver became her purpose, her drive, and her redemption. And in their presence, she began to feel whole again. The Warburton ballroom glimmered with opulence, yet it felt hollow. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the gathered elite, their laughter and polite chatter echoing off the marble floors. Keith Warburton stood at the altar, his posture stiff, his face carefully neutral. Beside him, Victoria White, a vision in silk and lace, smiled faintly, her beauty cold and calculated, like a porcelain doll made to be admired, but never touched. The officiant's voice droned on, but Keith's mind wandered. He barely registered the words binding him to this new life, each syllable a chain tightening around his chest. His gaze flitted to his mother, Kimberly, seated in the front row. She was radiant, her eyes gleaming with triumph as she nodded approvingly. This was her victory, not his. Victoria's hand slipped into his, cool and weightless. Keith forced himself to look at her, murmuring the vows he had rehearsed. The room erupted in applause as they exchanged rings, but the sound felt distant, muted. The kiss they shared was brief and devoid of passion, a hollow gesture for the sake of appearances. Later, at the reception, Keith stood by the grand fireplace, a glass of champagne in hand. He stared at the flames, their warmth failing to reach him. Around him, guests mingled, offering congratulations that felt more like obligations. Victoria flitted between conversations, her laughter polite but strained. She caught his eye briefly, her smile faltering before she turned away. Keith took a long sip of his drink, the bitterness burning his throat. His thoughts drifted to Michelle. He pictured her the way she had looked the last time he saw her. Rain-soaked, her suitcase in hand, her eyes filled with heartbreak. The memory clawed at him, but he pushed it aside. Regret wouldn't change the path he had chosen. Kimberly was completely comfortable in her surroundings. She moved through the room with practiced ease, basking in the compliments of her peers. A perfect match, they said. The Warburtons and the Whites. What a union. Her lips curved into a satisfied smile as she glanced at Keith and Victoria, standing side by side like chess pieces she had expertly positioned. But her satisfaction was short-lived. Victoria gave birth to a baby girl 9 months later. The nursery, once filled with anticipation, grew cold as Kimberly's disappointment became clear. Haley, Victoria had named her, the name chosen without Kimberly's input. Kimberly's reaction was subtle, but biting. "A daughter," she said, her voice carefully measured. "Well, at least she's beautiful." Victoria stiffened, cradling Haley closer. "She's perfect," she replied, her tone edged with defiance. Kimberly offered a tight smile, but her dissatisfaction was evident. Haley wasn't the heir she had envisioned. Kimberly's subtle criticisms grew sharper over time. Comments about Haley's delicate health, her temperament, even the way Victoria parented. Only fleeting glances and clipped conversations revealed the simmering tension beneath the surface. Keith, meanwhile, found himself adrift. His days were consumed by the routines of his family's business, his nights by the emptiness of his home. The marriage to Victoria was polite but distant. They spoke in pleasantries, their interactions careful and controlled. Victoria, he realized, was as much a prisoner of this union as he was. In the quiet hours, Keith's mind wandered back to Michelle. He often found himself reaching for the drawer in his office, where a single photograph lay hidden. It was from their honeymoon. Michelle laughing, her hair windswept, her eyes bright with joy. He would trace his thumb over her image, the ache in his chest sharpening with each glance. He wondered where she was, what she was doing. Did she hate him? Was she happy? The questions haunted him, their answers out of reach. One night, as he sat alone in the study, Haley's cries echoed faintly down the hall. Victoria's soothing voice followed, soft but weary. Keith stared into his glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light. His life, he realized, was a carefully curated facade. The legacy his mother had demanded he protect felt like a gilded cage, each golden bar forged from choices he couldn't undo. He stood, the photograph still in his hand, and walked to the window. The city lights sprawled out before him, a reminder of all the possibilities he had forsaken. Somewhere out there, Michelle was living a life beyond his reach. The thought both comforted and tormented him. Keith pressed his forehead against the cold glass, his breath fogging the pain. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the night, though no one was there to hear. The Warburton mansion maintained its grandeur, yet the fissures beneath its exterior widened daily. Kimberly's iron grip on the family began to falter as Victoria grew more defiant, determined to shield Haley from her mother-in-law's cutting expectations. Keith drifted further into himself, his regrets festering like an old wound, and in the shadows of his gilded life, the memory of Michelle burned like a quiet flame, a reminder of what he had lost and what he could never reclaim. The small cafe near the edge of Chicago's bustling downtown had become Michelle's second home. Its chipped tables and mismatched chairs were far from glamorous, but the steady rhythm of the work gave her a sense of control. Behind the counter, the hiss of the espresso machine mingled with the hum of quiet conversations and the occasional laugh from a customer. It was a morning like any other when Andrew first walked in. Michelle was at the register, a smudge of flour on her apron from handling pastries. She barely glanced up as the tall man in a navy coat placed his order. "Just a black coffee, please," he said, his voice warm but direct. Michelle nodded, punching the order into the old cash register. She glanced up as she handed him his change, catching the faint trace of a smile that seemed more genuine than most. Keith drifted further into himself, his regrets festering like an old wound. And in the shadows of his gilded life, the memory of Michelle burned like a quiet flame, a reminder of what he had lost and what he could never reclaim. The small cafe near the edge of Chicago's bustling downtown had become Michelle's second home. Its chipped tables and mismatched chairs were far from glamorous, but the steady rhythm of the work gave her a sense of control. Behind the counter, the hiss of the espresso machine mingled with the hum of quiet conversations and the occasional laugh from a customer. It was a morning like any other when Andrew first walked in. Michelle was at the register, a smudge of flour on her apron from handling pastries. She barely glanced up as the tall man in a navy coat placed his order. "Just a black coffee, please," he said, his voice warm but direct. Michelle nodded, punching the order into the old cash register. She glanced up as she handed him his change, catching the faint trace of a smile that seemed more genuine than most. "Thanks," he said, his hazel eyes lingering just a moment longer than necessary. Michelle offered a polite nod, then turned her attention to the next customer. Andrew sat near the window, pulling out a small notebook as the steam from his coffee curled upward. Their paths crossed again a week later, this time under less mundane circumstances. Michelle was at the playground with Carl and Oliver, the twins giggling as they toddled after each other in the damp grass. A sharp cry broke the peace as Carl tripped, falling face first onto the ground. "Carl!" Michelle rushed to him, scooping him up. Blood trickled from a small cut on his knee, and his wails grew louder. Panic bubbled in her chest. She had nothing but a tissue in her pocket and no idea how to properly clean the wound. "Here," came a familiar voice. She turned to see Andrew jogging toward them, a small first aid kit in hand. He crouched down, his coat brushing the ground, as he opened the kit with practiced ease. "I'm a doctor," he explained, glancing up briefly as he pulled out an antiseptic wipe. "May I?" Michelle hesitated, then nodded. Andrew cleaned the wound with gentle precision, murmuring softly to Carl to distract him. "There we go, all better," he said, securing a bandage in place. Carl's sobs had subsided into hiccups, his tear-streaked face now full of curiosity as he stared at Andrew. "Thank you," Michelle said quietly, her voice edged with both gratitude and exhaustion. Andrew stood, brushing off his knees. "It's no trouble. I work at the clinic down the street. I see little ones, like this, all the time." Over the weeks that followed, Andrew's presence became a quiet but steady part of Michelle's life. He stopped by the cafe regularly, sometimes with a book tucked under his arm, sometimes with a small gift for the boys, coloring books, toy cars, things he claimed were just lying around. Michelle found herself talking to him more, their conversations light and unassuming at first. They talked about Chicago winters, the best coffee spots in the city, and the occasional chaos of raising toddlers. Andrew listened more than he spoke, his questions thoughtful and his laughter easy. One day, as they sat outside during a rare warm afternoon, Andrew leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "You've built something special here," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the cafe and the bustling street. "It's not easy raising 2 boys on your own." Michelle's fingers tightened around her coffee mug. She gave a small shrug, her voice guarded. "You do what you have to." Andrew didn't press, sensing the wall she had quietly erected. Instead, he shifted the conversation, telling her about his time working in a small rural hospital and the quirks of his patients there. Michelle found herself smiling despite herself, the tension easing from her shoulders. Andrew's affection for Michelle grew in the small moments. When she carefully tucked a blanket around a sleeping Oliver at the cafe, or when her laugh, rare but genuine, lit up her face. But he never said anything, aware of the guardedness in her every gesture, the way she avoided speaking about her past. One evening, as they walked back from the park with the twins, Andrew spoke softly. "You know, Michelle, you don't always have to carry everything alone." She stopped, her hands tightening on the stroller's handle. The streetlights cast a soft glow on her face, and for a moment, she didn't respond. "It's not about carrying it alone," she said finally, her voice steady but distant. "It's about knowing you can't drop it." Andrew didn't push, but the look he gave her was one of quiet understanding. They continued walking in silence, the twins babbling softly to each other in the stroller. Michelle appreciated Andrew's presence, but she couldn't allow herself to lean on him, no matter how much easier it might make things. Her scars ran too deep, her trust too fragile. Yet as weeks turned into months, she found herself looking forward to their conversations, their quiet moments of companionship. Andrew never pried, never pushed. He was there, steady and patient, like the tide. And while Michelle's heart remained guarded, a small part of her began to wonder if, perhaps, she didn't have to face the world entirely alone. The windy city greeted Keith Warburton with its characteristic blend of noise, steel, and endless motion. He stepped off the train with his briefcase in hand, the worn leather a testament to years of business trips and negotiations. Chicago wasn't unfamiliar, but this time its streets felt different. The towering buildings seemed more oppressive, the bustling crowds a stark contrast to the isolation he carried within. He adjusted his tie, loosening it slightly as he checked his phone for the itinerary Kimberly had meticulously curated. A meeting with investors, a dinner with potential clients. The usual grind. The weight of expectation pressed against his chest, as suffocating as ever. Yet beneath it all was a hollow ache, a void that the success Kimberly lauded could never fill. Later that afternoon, his meeting concluded earlier than expected. Keith wandered through Millennium Park, his polished shoes incongruous against the worn concrete paths. The laughter of children rang out across the open spaces, their voices punctuated by the occasional bark of a dog or the rustle of wind through budding trees. It was uncharacteristic of him to linger, but something about the park's energy stilled his typically restless mind. As he approached a bench near a playground, a flash of movement caught his eye. A woman crouched beside 2 young boys. They were laughing, their identical faces glowing with delight as they tussled over a toy truck. Keith froze mid-step, his breath hitching. The woman turned her head slightly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Her profile was unmistakable, etched in his memory like an indelible mark. Michelle. 7 years have passed since she left. Keith's chest tightened. His gaze darted to the boys again, their features now under closer scrutiny. His heart thudded against his ribs as realization struck. Their sandy brown hair, the sharp line of their jaws, even the way one boy furrowed his brows in concentration, It was as if he were looking at his own childhood photographs. Keith retreated to a bench several yards away, sitting heavily as he tried to steady his breath. He observed the unfolding scene from the edge of his vision. Michelle laughed softly as she helped one boy zip his jacket, the other clinging to her arm. Her movements were fluid, practiced, the gestures of a mother deeply attuned to her children's needs. Guilt clawed at him, raw and relentless. He had done this. He had pushed her away, abandoned her to a world where she'd had to face this alone. And yet, here she was, resilient and radiant in a way he didn't deserve to witness. He felt like an intruder, his presence an unwelcome shadow in her sunlit world. But curiosity gnawed at him, relentless and insidious. How had she ended up here? Had she ever thought of him? And the boys, were they his? The following days found Keith distracted, his work a blur of half-hearted conversations and hollow pleasantries. He returned to the park more than once, each time keeping his distance, watching Michelle from afar. He noticed the way she carried herself, her movements confident, but edged with a subtle caution. She spoke gently to the boys, her words laced with patience and warmth. One afternoon, as Michelle corralled the boys toward a nearby cafe, Keith followed at a careful distance. The sign above the door read, "Bean and Bee Brew," its chipped paint, a stark contrast to the glossy coffee shops he frequented. Through the window, he saw Michelle behind the counter, her apron tied snugly around her waist as she handed a steaming mug to a customer. Keith lingered outside, the chill in the air seeping into his skin. He couldn't bring himself to go in. The questions swirling in his mind felt too heavy, the confrontation too sudden. Instead, he resolved to uncover the truth another way. That evening, back at his hotel, Keith pored over documents he had requested through a private investigator. The reports were concise, but revealing. Michelle had moved to Chicago shortly after their separation, taking up modest work while raising two boys, Carl and Oliver. Their ages aligned uncomfortably close to the timeline of their last days together. Keith's fingers tightened around the edges of the paper. What do you think of Keith, the character who is listening to this story? If you feel he is more pitiful, leave a comment saying matcha, and if you feel he is more blameworthy, leave a comment saying Vani. The truth was undeniable. They were his. He felt a heavy burden of regret. Images of their time together resurfaced. Michelle's laughter, her gentle touch, the way she had looked at him with unwavering trust. He had destroyed that trust, and in doing so, he had missed 6 years of a life he might have had. The photo of Michelle with Carl and Oliver that accompanied the report seemed to taunt him. The boys stood on either side of her, their grins wide, their eyes shining with the kind of joy that Keith hadn't felt in years. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The hollow life he had built, his marriage to Victoria, his role as the dutiful Warburton heir, felt meaningless in the face of this new reality. The next morning, Keith found himself back at the park. Michelle was there as usual, her boys chasing each other around the swings. This time, Keith didn't stay in the shadows. He took a step forward, his heart pounding, the weight of 7 years of guilt and longing pressing against his chest. "Michelle," he called softly. She turned, her expression shifting from confusion to shock. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world seemed to hold its breath, the laughter of children fading into the background. "Keith," she finally said, her voice steady but guarded. And just like that, the past collided with the present, their lives once again entwined in a way neither of them could have anticipated. Michelle stood frozen, her gaze locked on Keith. The playground's warmth, the laughter of children, the chatter of parents faded into a dull hum eclipsed by the weight of his presence. He looked older, his once proud posture tempered by something softer, something broken. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp, like a blade held ready. Keith hesitated, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat. "I'm here for work," he said, his tone quiet. I didn't expect." He glanced at Carl and Oliver, who were now watching curiously from the swings. His voice faltered. "They're mine, aren't they?" Michelle's jaw tightened, her hands instinctively moving to her sides, shielding her sons from the weight of his words. "It doesn't matter," she said coldly. "You made your choice years ago." Keith flinched at her tone, the guilt he'd been carrying swelling into something unbearable. "I didn't know, Michelle. I didn't know about them." She moved forward, her voice reduced to a harsh whisper. "You didn't know because you didn't care to ask. You threw me away like I was nothing, Keith. And now, after 7 years, you think you can just waltz back into my life?" Keith's gaze dropped to the ground. "It wasn't like that," he murmured, though the words felt hollow, even to him. "Oh, wasn't it?" Michelle snapped, her voice rising. "Because from where I stood, it was exactly like that. You chose your family, your legacy, and your precious image over me, over us." The raw pain in her words pierced Keith more deeply than he expected. He struggled for something to say, some way to explain the years of silence, the regret that had gnawed at him every day since she left. "I was wrong," he said finally, his voice trembling. "I was weak, and I'm sorry." Michelle's expression softened for a brief moment before hardening again. "Sorry isn't enough," she said, her voice quieter now, but no less resolute. "Not after everything I've been through. Not after everything they've been through." Keith glanced at the boys again. Carl was whispering to Oliver, their small faces a perfect mirror of his own childhood. "I just want to be part of their lives," he said. "I don't want to take them away from you, Michelle. I just want to be there." Her laugh was bitter, her head shaking. "Be there? Like you were there for me. Like you were there when I was pregnant and terrified and completely alone." She crossed her arms over her chest, her eyes narrowing. "You don't get to swoop in now and act like some savior." Keith took a step closer, his voice soft but insistent. "I'm not asking to take over. I'm asking for a chance. For them. For you." Michelle's lips tightened into a thin line. "There is no us, Keith. Not anymore. I've moved on." The words hit him like a punch, and he stiffened. "You're seeing someone." "Yes," she said, her tone unwavering. "Andrew. He's kind, dependable, and he doesn't abandon the people he loves when things get hard." Keith's jaw clenched. The name stung, not because he knew Andrew, but because it confirmed that Michelle had built a life without him, a life he had no part in. "I'm glad," he said finally, though the words felt bitter in his mouth. "But I still want to be there for Carl and Oliver." Michelle's stance remained firm. "You don't get to disrupt their lives because of your guilt. They're happy, Keith. They have stability, love, and a home. What can you offer them? A father who walked away before they were even born." His chest tightened, but he refused to back down. "A chance to know the truth, to know their father." Michelle sighed, her exhaustion permeating her resolve. "And what happens when you go back to New York? Back to your wife, your mother? Do you really think you can be the father they need while you're tangled in the life you chose?" Keith's face paled at her words, but he didn't falter. "I just want to try, even if it's only as a friend. Please, Michelle." She studied him for a long moment, her heart warring with itself. A part of her yearned to permanently close this chapter of her life. But there was another part, a smaller, quieter part, that still longed for some semblance of closure, for her boys to know their father, if only in fragments. "Fine," she said at last, her voice low and clipped, "but on my terms, and the moment I think this is hurting them, you're gone." Keith nodded, a wave of relief sweeping over him. "Thank you," he whispered. "Don't thank me," Michelle said sharply, turning to gather her boys. "This isn't for you." Keith stood motionless as she walked away, Carl and Oliver gripping her hands tightly. The weight of his choices hung heavy around him, but for the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope. Small, tentative and fragile, but there. Kimberly Warburton had never been one to tolerate uncertainty. Information was her currency, and she had long mastered the art of unearthing secrets. The truth about Carl and Oliver came to her through carefully placed whispers. An unnamed informant from Keith's business dealings in Chicago. The news confirmed what she had long suspected. Keith's departure from tradition had not been without consequence. "2 boys," Kimberly murmured, her voice cold and calculating as she stared at the report in her hands. The investigators' photographs of Carl and Oliver glared back at her. 2 strikingly familiar faces, their resemblance to Keith undeniable. Her lips curled into a faint smile, the edges of her satisfaction tempered by disdain. She dismissed the file onto her ornate desk and glanced toward a family portrait on the mantel. Haley's cherubic face stared back at her, framed by Victoria's proud but weary smile. Kimberly's own expression in the photograph was poised, perfect, an illusion she no longer cared to maintain. "A daughter," she scoffed under her breath, her tone dripping with disappointment. Haley was an afterthought, a placeholder in a lineage that demanded strong male heirs. Carl and Oliver were different. They were the future of the Warburton legacy, and Kimberly was determined to bring them into the fold. Whether Michelle agreed or not. Victoria White Warburton had grown used to the quiet battles that played out in the Warburton household. Kimberly's sharp remarks disguised as advice, Keith's distracted silences, the constant, suffocating weight of expectation. It all felt like an endless performance, and Victoria had been cast in a role she never auditioned for. But lately, the veneer had started to crack. She first noticed Kimberly's sudden interest in Keith's business trip to Chicago. The questions were subtle but pointed. The tension between them shifted when Kimberly returned from a private meeting, her usually composed demeanor replaced by a razor-sharp focus. "What's in Chicago, Kimberly?" Victoria asked one evening, her tone casual but probing as they sat in the parlor. Kimberly's smile was tight, dismissive. "Opportunity," she replied. "For Keith, for the family. That's all you need to know." Victoria's unease deepened. Over the following weeks, Kimberly's disdain for Haley became more pronounced, her remarks cutting deeper than before. Perhaps if she were more disciplined, Kimberly mused once, after Haley spilled her juice. Another time, a shame she's not a boy. The Warburtons need stability. The implications stung, but Victoria's growing frustration turned into resolve. Haley wasn't Kimberly's pawn. She wasn't going to let her daughter, or herself, be molded into something they weren't. The plane touched down in Chicago, and Kimberly stepped into the city with purpose. The limousine pulled up in front of Michelle's modest apartment, a stark contrast to the Warburton estate's grandeur. Kimberly stepped out, her tailored coat pristine, her expression as frosty as the January air. Michelle watched her approach from the window, a sense of foreboding settling in her chest. Andrew stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder. "Do you want me to stay?" he asked, his voice steady. Michelle nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Yes." Kimberly's knock was precise, and Michelle opened the door to meet her former mother-in-law's piercing gaze. "Michelle," Kimberly said smoothly, her tone almost cordial. "We need to talk." Andrew stepped forward, his presence a quiet but solid wall. Kimberly's eyes flicked to him briefly, dismissing him as one might a piece of furniture. "I see you've moved on," she said, her voice edged with mock civility. Michelle declined the invitation. "What do you want, Kimberly?" Kimberly stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her eyes scanning the humble space with thinly veiled disdain. "Carl and Oliver," she said bluntly. "They belong with their father's family." Michelle's breath caught, but she refused to let Kimberly see her falter. "They belong with me," she said firmly. "They've always belonged with me." Kimberly arched an eyebrow, her expression almost amused. "And you've done admirably, given your circumstances. But let's be realistic, Michelle. The Warburton name offers them opportunities you could never dream of." Michelle stepped closer, her voice low and fierce. "You don't get to decide what's best for them. You didn't care about them when I was pregnant, and you don't care about them now. You only care about what they can do for you." Kimberly's smile was thin, her eyes gleaming with cold calculation. "Don't be naive. You think your little life here is enough for them? What happens when they start asking questions? When they realize what they're missing?" "They're missing nothing," Andrew interjected, his voice calm but firm. "They have a mother who loves them and a life filled with stability. That's more than any title or name could give them." Kimberly's gaze shifted to him, her disdain sharpening. "And who are you to involve yourself in family matters?" "I'm someone who cares about them," Andrew said evenly, "and someone who won't let you bulldoze over Michelle or her sons." Kimberly's composure cracked for a moment, her lips thinning into a harsh line. She turned back to Michelle, her voice colder than ever. "This isn't over. You can't keep them from their birthright." Michelle's heart pounded, but her resolve didn't waver. "Watch me." Kimberly's departure was as swift as her arrival, the door closing behind her with a sharp click. Michelle exhaled shakily, leaning into Andrew's steady presence. "She won't stop," she murmured, her voice trembling. "No," Andrew agreed, his hand warm against her back. "But neither will we." The Warburton mansion loomed in its usual oppressive grandeur as Keith stepped through the front door. The weight of his return to New York pressed heavily on his shoulders. He had barely set down his briefcase when Victoria appeared in the hallway, her arms crossed and her gaze sharp. "Kimberly went to Chicago, didn't she?" Victoria's voice was calm, but there was a steeliness beneath it. Keith froze, his jaw tightening. "Who told you?" "Haley heard her on the phone," Victoria said, stepping closer. "Kimberly wasn't exactly subtle about her plans to secure the family's future. I know she went after Michelle. And your sons." Keith winced at the words, his hands clenching into fists. "Victoria, you knew," Victoria interrupted, her tone colder now. "You knew about them, about her, and you didn't think I deserved to know." Keith sighed, running a hand through his hair. The exhaustion etched across his face made him look older, more worn. "I didn't know until I went to Chicago," he admitted, his voice low. "I saw Michelle. I saw Carl and Oliver. I know they're mine." Victoria blinked, her composure faltering. "And you just kept this from me? From all of us?" "I didn't know how to tell you," Keith said, his voice cracking, "but I couldn't stop Kimberly. She's only thinking about the Warburton name, not what's best for anyone." Victoria stared at him for a long moment before speaking, her voice quieter but no less firm. "You'd better figure out what's best for you, Keith, before it's too late." The atmosphere in the Warburton mansion was tense, charged with unspoken words and growing resentment. Victoria sat in the parlor, Haley playing quietly on the floor. The sound of Keith's footsteps in the hallway made her shoulders tense. She had waited long enough. "Keith," she called, her voice calm but resolute. He hesitated in the doorway, then stepped inside, his gaze wary. "What is it, Victoria?" She stood, crossing her arms. "We need to talk. About Chicago. About Kimberly. About everything." Keith sighed, the weight of the past weeks pressing heavily on him. "Victoria, I already told you." "No," she interrupted, her tone sharp. "You didn't tell me anything. You avoided the truth until there was no way to hide it. Kimberly's actions, the boys, Michelle, everything. And you let it happen." Keith's shoulders slumped, but he didn't defend himself. "I didn't know how to handle it," he admitted. Victoria's voice cracked with anger. "Of course you didn't, because you've spent your entire life letting Kimberly dictate every move you make, and now she's dragging Haley and me down with you." Keith flinched, his guilt plain on his face. "That's not fair, isn't it?" Victoria's voice rose, her frustration spilling over. "You knew what Kimberly was planning, and you did nothing to stop her. Haley is just a pawn to her, and you've allowed it. And now you expect me to stay and pretend everything is fine." Keith opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The truth of her accusations weighed too heavily. Victoria took a deep breath, her voice softening but losing none of its resolve. "I'm leaving, Keith. I'm taking Haley, and we're starting over. Somewhere Kimberly can't control us. Somewhere you can't let her." Keith's heart sank. "Victoria, please, don't do this." She shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You've left me no choice. I've tried to be patient, to protect Haley from this toxic family. But I won't let her grow up thinking she's not enough just because she's not what Kimberly wanted." Keith stepped forward, his voice pleading. "Victoria, I can change. I'll talk to Kimberly, "It's too late, Keith," she said firmly. "I can't keep waiting for you to prioritize us over her. Haley deserves better. I deserve better." The following morning, Victoria packed quietly, her movements deliberate and careful. Haley sat on the bed, clutching a small stuffed bear, her big eyes watching her mother with a mix of confusion and sadness. "Are we going on an adventure, Mommy?" Haley asked softly. Victoria knelt beside her, brushing a curl from her daughter's face. "Yes, sweetheart. A big adventure. Just you and me." Haley smiled faintly, the innocence in her expression breaking Victoria's heart. She hugged her tightly, whispering a promise to herself to give Haley a life free from the suffocating grasp of the Warburton name. Keith stood in the foyer as Victoria descended the grand staircase with their suitcases in tow. He looked at her, his eyes pleading, but he didn't stop her. He knew he had no right. "Goodbye, Keith," she said quietly, her tone devoid of malice, but heavy with finality. He watched as she walked out the door, Haley's hand in hers. The sound of the car engine starting and fading into the distance was the only thing that broke the silence. The knock on Michelle's apartment door was sharp and deliberate. Andrew's brows furrowed as he glanced toward Michelle, who stood frozen, her hand tightening around a dish towel. She didn't need to ask who it was. "I'll get it," Andrew said, stepping forward. "No," Michelle whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I'll handle her." Kimberly Warburton stood on the threshold, her tailored coat impeccable, her expression as cold as the Chicago winter outside. "Michelle," she said smoothly, her tone laced with feigned politeness. "May I come in?" Michelle stepped outside, closing the door behind her to shield Carl and Oliver from Kimberly's presence. "We don't have anything to discuss," Michelle said firmly, folding her arms. "Oh, but we do," Kimberly replied, her gaze sharp and assessing. "Those boys are Warburtons. They deserve the opportunities this family can provide." Michelle's eyes narrowed, her voice rising. "They deserve a life where they're loved for who they are, not what they represent to someone like you. Kimberly tilted her head, her expression almost amused. You really think this small life you've built is enough for them? With your companion? Her gaze flicked dismissively to the closed door. Playing the role of father? Don't be naive. Michelle stepped closer, her voice low and fierce. You don't get to decide what's enough for my children. You don't get to come here and act like you care about them. They're not pawns in your power games, Kimberly. They're my sons, and they're staying with me. The door opened behind Michelle, and Andrew emerged, his presence solid and calm. She's made herself clear, Andrew said, his voice firm. You should leave. Kimberly's composure cracked, her lips thinning. You'll regret this, she hissed, her cold arrogance faltering. The Warburton name. Enough. The voice came from behind her, and Kimberly stiffened. Keith stood at the base of the apartment steps, his face pale but determined. He rushed back to Chicago after learning that his mother would bother Michelle. Mother, let it go. Kimberly turned sharply, her disbelief evident. Keith, this is about the family. No, Keith interrupted, his voice steelier than Michelle had ever heard. This is about you and your obsession with control. Let them go. Kimberly's mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time, she saw the resolve in her son's eyes, and it unnerved her. With a final withering look, she turned and strode away, her heels clicking against the pavement. When Kimberly was gone, the tension between Michelle and Keith was palpable. Andrew stepped aside, his gaze flickering between them before retreating back into the apartment to give them privacy. Thank you, Michelle said after a moment, her voice guarded. Keith nodded, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. I didn't come here to fight, Michelle. I needed to make sure she wouldn't hurt you. Or them. Michelle crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. Why now, Keith? Why not 7 years ago? Keith's shoulders slumped. Because I was a coward. Because I let her dictate my life, and I let you pay the price for it. He looked up, his gaze softening. I've made a lot of mistakes, Michelle. But I don't want to make another one. Michelle's voice wavered with emotion. What do you want, Keith? I want you to be happy, he said simply. With Andrew. With the boys. I don't deserve to be part of their lives. Not after everything I've done. But I'd like to be here, even if it's just from a distance, to see them grow up. Michelle studied him, her heart conflicted. The man before her was no longer the Keith she had known. Arrogant, controlled by ambition. He looked broken, remorseful. But there was something else in his eyes. Sincerity. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, she admitted, her voice quiet. Keith nodded. I don't expect you to, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be someone worth forgiving. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Michelle standing on the porch, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and an odd sense of closure. She turned back to the apartment, where Andrew was waiting with a quiet strength that steadied her. As she entered and shut the door, she sensed the burden of the past dissipating, creating space for the life she had tirelessly strived to establish. The sun was warm on Michelle's face as she walked hand in hand with Carl and Oliver through the park. Andrew strolled beside her, a soft smile playing on his lips as the boys dashed ahead to the playground. Their laughter rang out, bright and carefree, a melody that filled the once empty corners of Michelle's heart. Watch me, Mum, Carl called, climbing the jungle gym with determination. Be careful, Michelle called back, though her smile betrayed her pride. Andrew leaned closer, his voice low and teasing. You know he's not going to slow down. Michelle laughed softly. I know, But it's a mother's job to worry. Andrew reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. And you do it beautifully. Michelle experienced a complete release from the burden of her past for the first time in years. She glanced at Andrew, gratitude and love filling her gaze. This was her family now, a life she had built with resilience and a strength she never thought she possessed. Back in New York, Keith sat alone in his study, the Warburton mansion unnaturally quiet. On his desk lay a photo Michelle had sent of Carl and Oliver at the playground. He traced a finger over their smiling faces, a wistful ache settling in his chest. He glanced out the window at the sprawling estate, its grandeur hollow, without the family he had lost. The echoes of Kimberly's ambition and his own cowardice reverberated through the empty halls. He was uncertain if the wound caused by Victoria's departure would ever heal. And Haley's laughter had become a distant memory he longed to reclaim. Keith knew he couldn't undo the years of pain he had caused, but he wasn't willing to lose more. A plane ticket to Los Angeles sat beside the photograph, Victoria's last known address scribbled in the corner. For once, Keith felt a spark of resolve, a determination to try, to find Haley and Victoria, to make amends, no matter how difficult the path. Kimberly sat alone in the grand parlor, the fire casting flickering shadows on her carefully composed face. She had driven away everyone she claimed to love, Keith, Victoria, and even Haley. The empire she had fought so hard to preserve now felt like an empty monument to her ambition. Reaching for the family portrait on the mantel, she ran her fingers over the timeless faces. For the first time in years, Kimberly's composure cracked, a tear slipping down her cheek. The legacy she had so fiercely protected had cost her everything. As twilight settled over Chicago, Michelle, Andrew, Carl, and Oliver sat on a picnic blanket beneath a canopy of stars. The boys huddled close, their eyes wide as Andrew spun a story about constellations and mythical creatures. Michelle watched them, her heart full. The past had scarred her, but it hadn't broken her. She had found love, laughter, and the kind of joy she once thought impossible. Andrew turned to her, his voice soft. "Are you happy?" Michelle smiled, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Yes," she whispered, "I really am." And as the stars twinkled above, Michelle knew that this was only the beginning of a brighter, more hopeful future. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.